of elite aristocrats to kind of foot soldiers in huge armies of tens of thousands.
They love this idea of bored samurai.
Especially the Japanese military were directly related to kind of the samurai warriors of the past.
What do you think they can learn there that they aren't going to learn elsewhere?
I think to that diversity of roles that they've played within society.
What comes to mind when you hear the word samurai? You are probably picturing a Japanese warrior wearing the distinctive kabuto helmet and wielding a katana. But the real story of the samurai is actually a lot more complicated and a lot more human than what we've seen on TV or even in most books. Hi, I'm your host, Emily Snow, and this is The Collector, where we collect the stories and the ideas that shape art, history, and culture, one exclusive conversation at a time with the experts who know them best. Glad to have you here. Rosina and Oleg are the co-authors of Samurai, a new book being published alongside the British Museum's major exhibition of the same name. The book is unique because it uses real objects to tell the real story of the samurai, starting with the beginnings as a medieval warrior class in Japan, all the way up to their enduring legacy in global contemporary pop culture. Before we dive into the interview, I want to establish just a little bit of context for us. The word samurai literally means one who serves. For centuries, the samurai were elite warriors. They served powerful lords and Japan's military government. Most of us, of course, picture the armor and the battles. But the samurai were also deeply involved in social, political, and cultural life in Japan. And they changed a lot over the centuries. The samurai warrior class was technically abolished in the late 19th century, but the idea of the samurai has lived on and has really since become a global icon of Japanese culture. And if I can start with you, Rosina, can you tell me about what first drew you to studying the samurai? And can you also tell me a little bit about how this project with the British Museum came to be?
I am a curator of the Japanese collections. So I am interested in finding ways to bring the collections, put them on display in new ways to people that they can relate to. It's difficult to present something completely fresh. And the idea of the samurai as this globally recognizable Japanese phenomenon was an interesting one to explore, that there's a wealth of real objects that the samurai used, that they wore, but there's also a tremendously rich history of representation right from 12th, 13th centuries through to the present day, and the very varied ways that the samurai image has been used, played with in the post-war period. So I thought this would be a perfect example of how the British Museum can explore all of that historical reality and myth-making, take what people know, build on it, challenge it, help them understand something better, and look at it in a different way. And it's been a wonderful experience building that over the past few years in consultation with Oleg and then with the wonderful team here at the British Museum to realize the project physically. I think it was in my head for 5 years more as an idea, and then over the past year and a half, it's become a reality. And there's a huge team of people who are helping achieve it.
Wonderful. And Oleg, how about you? What drew you to the subject of the samurai? And tell me more about how you and Rosina came together to co-author the book.
I guess I was thinking the other day, I've been working on samurai, I think, for about 25 years now. I moved to Japan around 2000 and studied the language and done a bit of work, and then came across a couple of kind of interesting texts at that time that I wanted to know more about that had something to do with Bushido or the way of the samurai. And so went on and did a master's and a PhD kind of on that subject, essentially kind of studying how that came about, really, looking through historical sources. And a lot of that led me to understand that a lot of what we know about the samurai is kind of either modern, if not a complete invention, but a reconstruction and kind of reinterpretation of things that were there in the past, and that really influences kind of how we understand samurai, but also how they're portrayed, exhibited, and in collections and things like that. And since that time, I've done work on kind of Japanese castles and material culture. And so when Rosina got in touch about this exhibition, probably about 5 years ago now, it was just a wonderful opportunity and a chance to kind of actually learn a lot more for me.
That's really neat. Great to hear how you came to this project and that it's been a years-long endeavor that is taking physical form. That's really exciting. And so as Rosina touched on, I think we're all familiar with samurai. The idea of samurai has captured imaginations around the world for centuries. What do you both think has made the samurai remain such a resonant cultural phenomenon?
I think there has been an awareness of the samurai image in this country, at least for hundreds of years. In the exhibition, we have a suit of armor that was sent by the shogun Tokugawa Hidetada to England, to London, with an English trader in 1613. And it's been on display in the Tower of London since that time, pretty much continuously. So the main thing is the distinctive visual qualities of Japanese armor, especially the helmet, the lacing all over, on all of the parts, but then the helmet with this flared neck guard that's also plates laced together. So the first thing is that it's instantly recognizable as Japanese. And once you've been made aware of it, it's been interesting recently. I've showed some people and they don't know that it's Japanese when they look at the armor, but I think once you've learned that that's Japanese armor, you always recognize it. It has distinctive qualities to it. So there is a physical reality there, but there's this whole panoply of myth that has developed around it that I think is also very attractive to people. And that's what Oleg was referring to just now with Bushido, and there's also a long history of that in this country and around the world. So the two things have kind of accrued together and made this very attractive, idealized figure that then people can project ideas and values back onto that don't play out when you investigate the historical reality. And I think there's nothing problematic or controversial about it that prevents people from playing with it. There aren't necessarily cultural sensitivities that you have to be careful with. And if you go to Japan, you see historical reenactors dressed up as the samurai warrior, and you can dress up in Japanese costume as a tourist. It's available to people there. It's not something that they're sensitive or protective about. Obviously, you don't want to do anything offensive with it, but it's there for people to play with both within Japan and outside Japan without it causing offense.
I would echo that. I think the aesthetics are a really key part of this. I mean, as people who go to the exhibition will be able to see, or, in the book, kind of the images we've got there of kind of the armor, the swords, kind of the paintings, the woodblock prints, the other objects. I mean, it's really amazing craftsmanship. They're really beautiful things. And then, there's so many just fantastic stories and narratives. Kind of a lot of Japan's kind of national legends, national stories, are things that are really to do with the samurai. Some of the most famous tales that, if were plays or, kind of oral transmission for a long time, and then kind of going into the, into kind of being written as textual sources, then becoming films and radio programs, and now video games and other things. So these things just being repackaged as having such a long kind of history. And I think there's also a real resonance between kind of the samurai in Japan and especially Britain, but then also the rest of the world, which takes place around the turn of the 20th century as Japan is kind of opening up, becoming militarily also more assertive. And when Japan defeats Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, people are looking for some kind of secret to that. Like, why is Japan so powerful? And the samurai spirit is something that people in Japan kind of focus on and project outwards and say, oh, this is the reason for Japanese success, and people in other countries are doing the same thing. So I think that's the point where the samurai kind of go global. So, at the start of the 20th century, and then it kind of comes and goes before that, and now we're kind of another kind of peak in samurai popularity. There's a bit of a nadir in samurai popularity in the US or UK around the 1930s, 1940s, obviously with the wartime. But then, comes back in the late 20th century. And I think the point that Rosina makes about it being, that people can take the samurai and do various things with it. I think, that it's there to a certain extent for appropriation by people in Japan and people in other countries. Video game studios in other countries can make samurai video games, things like that. And there's not so much controversy in the sense within Japan. There are other issues in other places around, for example, in other parts of East Asia, especially, that, either suffered from the samurai, such as Korea, which was invaded in the 1590s, or around the time of the Second World War, where samurai imagery is really kind of prominent and popular. And so, there are these kind of sensitivities around the way the samurai image is used sometimes. And that's something we address in the exhibition. You have to have, the kind of the cool armors and all of the nice things, but then you do also have to address these kind of darker sides that are very much part of it.
Right. And so speaking of getting a little bit deeper than just the armor and the idealized image that we are also familiar with, are there any particular misconceptions about samurai that you are aiming to address with the objects in your book and in the exhibition?
I think primarily it's this very narrow perception of the samurai, and we can talk about that term and unpack it a little bit, perhaps. It's a shorthand that we use in the non-Japanese speaking realms, but that figure is limited to, the image of the samurai is limited to a male warrior in this distinctive armor holding a sword with that very distinctive helmet. And that's all people know, and they think that that's what samurai means. But the exhibition and the book are trying to explain that they had many roles across the centuries for the best part of 1,000 years. And there's a lot of fluidity in the early centuries in terms of class, who's a warrior, who's a part-time warrior. But by 1600, you're getting a stratification of society literally into 4 different classes. The samurai are the elite. They're in control of society, and as a social class, it's composed of half men, half women. There are samurai children as well. They are not fighting. They have bureaucratic roles, or the women have roles running the household. So it's not just about that unitary or sole figure of the man in armor. And I think there's something about the glorification or the idealization of that figure that troubled me. So I wanted to show there's a lot more to the story than that.
I would echo that. I think it's that that kind of diversity of the samurai that I think is quite that's often flattened in a lot of the kind of popular culture representations and what people think. I mean, it's 6 centuries of history, and it's an incredibly diverse group across that. And so, in Japanese, the term samurai, samurai isn't really used traditionally as like a catch-all term, because there are so many specific groups. There are, like, at different times in different places, going kind of from mounted archers early on, like very kind of elite aristocrats, to kind of, foot soldiers in huge armies of tens of thousands, to kind of bureaucrats in the early modern period. It's hugely diverse. And I think one of the other kind of things that we want to kind of get across in both the book and the exhibition is around kind of the global influences on the samurai. That it's the samurai it's a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, in the sense that all of these things are coming together in quite a unique way within Japan, but it's actually a lot of influences from different places. So early on, there's a lot of influences from China on kind of samurai thought, religion, all sorts of other things, and kind of warriors initially. Then, there's invasions by the Mongols in the 13th century, which have a big influence. Then, engagement with Europe, engagement with, there's invasions of Korea. And then you get into the modern period, and again, there's incursions by Russia. Japan is then becoming more engaged in the continent as well, and other countries. And so all of these things kind of coming in, but then also how that samurai image is being projected outward. So, already from Japan repelling the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, Japan is starting to be seen in other countries as, kind of a nation of warriors, as this kind of uniquely martial nation, that, and Japanese who are then going abroad in like Southeast Asia in the early modern period, they're being seen as warriors. Even if the Japanese doing this are merchants or anything else, everyone thinks, oh, you're Japanese, you must be a warrior. And so it really influences views of Japan abroad. And I think that's one of the kind of things that we also want to kind of bring through is really how kind of global really a lot of the influences on the samurai image are.
Really fascinating. So we have samurai as this kind of global image being projected outward. And I think what's really neat about your book and the exhibition is how object-based it is, and how there are so many different types of objects from various collections. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what some of these objects can reveal about how the samurai actually lived, the men, women, and as you said, children who were samurai, and how it was that they saw and understood themselves.
The exhibition is divided into 3 sections. It's broadly chronological, and for the periods when the samurai actually existed in some form, the section 1 about the medieval centuries, and then section 2 about the Edo period from about 1600 through to 1860s. And the first section is really about warfare, acknowledging that the samurai originated as mercenaries. They were proxy warriors for the court who gradually established themselves as a social class, wanted to achieve legitimacy akin to courtiers, as well as having that brute military force, as well as achieving power through force. You have to establish yourself legitimately. So in that section of the exhibition, we've got a lot of the kit, splendid suits of armor, the earliest form that were suitable for mounted archery, together with the saddles, the bows and arrows, the quivers that were needed for mounted archery. And then the development of armor we demonstrate through 2 subsequent forms that were more suitable for infantry. As Oleg said, there's this shift in combat techniques from small groups, small skirmishes of mounted archers who have circling around each other with maybe a few men on foot, but then it develops by the 1500 into larger massed groups of infantry. We're talking about the representations of samurai in this period as well, in the earlier centuries, the medieval period, the portraits that they're having, they're commissioning of themselves, but also screen paintings depicting battles, and hand scroll paintings particularly were being produced to record some of these momentous battles and campaigns, but also the culture. So one of the main points in section 1 is that culture is just as important as the power, and the way that you achieve that legitimacy and position yourself as being akin to the imperial court, which continues all the way through Japanese history, even when the warriors are in command. The way you do that is through exercising culture. A lot of those principles are taken from China. As Oleg said, there's Chinese thought, the philosophy, the religion, and the culture. So it's about the painting and tea practice. No theatre develops in the 1500s. Interior decoration, the appreciation for Chinese antiques. We touch on all of these things in section 1. And then some of the objects that are associated with those attempted invasions of Korea that Oleg mentioned, and the final coalescing of the various domain lords, the various warlords under a single figure, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who takes us into section 2. And there it's about the peace. It's a very different atmosphere in the exhibition. It's a different experience for people in Japan at that time. They've moved into a period of peace which unexpectedly lasts. It continues for 250 years. So it's the objects that the men are wearing, which is not really armor at this point. It's a kind of business suit, starched hemp robes. But during this period, they are warriors in status only. They're a standing army. The samurai are more or less 10% of the population. It varies according to domain. They're a standing army. So they do have the military equipment, they undertake military training, but they don't actually ever have the opportunity or the need to go onto the battlefield. So we also have a lot about the things they're doing in their off hours, so to speak, when they're not on duty, as government ministers or the tax collectors or the guards in a castle gate. They are appreciating painting. Sometimes they're creating paintings themselves. They're writing books. They're undertaking natural history studies, botanical studies, antiquarian studies. And then we've got a case about women that, as we said, half of the samurai are women. So a lot of the cultural objects, the women would be the elite, the upper ranks of the samurai. The women would be enjoying those as well, but there's robes and toiletry equipment, that kind of thing that we present to help people understand their lives. A case about children, the sort of objects that they were using as well, clothing and toys. And then a large section on the representations of the samurai during that period. So those are the kind of objects.
Yeah, and on that last point, I think as Rosina says, the things they're commissioning, but the samurai influence goes well beyond the samurai, in that all kind of classes of Japanese society at this time are really consuming samurai content, in the sense that we have plays, we have books, we have woodblock prints, and a lot of those are actually drawing on, and we're talking now from the period from the early 17th century up to the late 19th century, so 250 years of peace. As Rosina says, they're a standing army. They're not actually fighting. They're training with swords and some other weapons like that. They're not usually working with guns, which are actually kind of the most effective weapon in the 16th century, before the country is pacified. So, the extent to which they're training in kind of practical warfare is another question. But a lot of this popular culture from the early modern periods, so 1600 to late 19th century, is focused on kind of great battles and heroes from the centuries before that. So, especially kind of from the late 12th century, but also kind of the battles of the 13th and 14th centuries and beyond. And so you're getting these, amazing stories, woodblock prints, plays, all sorts of things. People are recreating armors from that time, commissioning armors that are of these ancient designs. Everyone is kind of consuming this sort of popular culture. A lot of this stuff ends up being quite legendary, really. But another reason people are consuming all of this kind of historical fiction, so to speak, is that in the early modern period under the Tokugawa shoguns, you're not allowed to talk about contemporary politics. So that's kind of off limits at that time. There's a lot of censorship there. But what you can do is you can kind of talk about contemporary politics by kind of finding an analogous case 300 or 400 years earlier where there was a conflict about something or a dispute, and people will look at it and they will all assume or realize that, oh, actually you're talking about this thing that's going on right now, but you're using these other fictional characters, these ancient things. So and I think that's where the samurai then just really, even though many people probably in their day-to-day life, people from the other social classes would have probably really despised many of the samurai and really resented them, they're still consuming a lot of this kind of samurai content. If your kind of 18th century merchant would have had the option to sit down and play Ghost of Tsushima, she would have probably done that.
That's awesome. And so there are centuries of the proliferation of samurai content for entertainment, but also sounds like for other purposes, like political conversation that otherwise wasn't allowed. And so speaking of popular culture, you mentioned, Oleg, that samurai and popular culture are kind of experiencing a resurgence even now. And I'm curious what your take is on pop culture media like video games like Assassin's Creed Shadows, or popular books and TV series like Last Samurai Standing. As an expert in the study of samurai, do you engage with these types of media? And what do you think of them?
A fair bit with video games. I did quite a few things on Ghost of Tsushima when they came out about 4 or 5 years ago, which is an amazing looking game. And now we've got Ghost of Yote coming out of it much more recently. And these are all fantastic products. I think one of the things that I would really kind of pick up from a lot of this popular culture, and the things that are produced, is who is producing it, and who is consuming it. I think is really interesting. That it's something like Ghost of Tsushima is being created by I believe a US studio. I think that's Sucker Punch Games. Then we have things like Assassin's Creed Shadows. That's Ubisoft, which is mainly Franco-Canadian, I believe. And so again, as Rosina mentioned earlier, the samurai is there as something that can be appropriated by people around the world. It's a globally recognizable icon. People recognize some of the stories and tropes around it. So you can kind of take it, you can make a game, you can make a TV show, and people will kind of recognize kind of what that is. And I think it's interesting because oftentimes those cultural products then reflect kind of some of the concerns and debates that are going on in those societies, rather than what's actually going on in Japan, or what kind of, the historical samurai were doing. And you mentioned Assassin's Creed Shadows. That's one of the most kind of controversial ones of recent years. Some playable characters are kind of a black samurai and kind of a woman ninja. And, this is kind of then feeds into a lot of the debates that were going on around kind of various, I guess, what we would call culture wars mainly in North America, but other places as well. And we do have, historical evidence for the existence of, we think it's probably samurai of African descent. But this is then heavily fictionalized in this game, and becomes quite controversial. So, sorry. So who is producing these things, and who is consuming them, and how is really interesting. And some of these things succeed in Japan, and some of these end up being just as controversial or maybe flopping in Japan.
Rosina, do you have anything to add about just your take on contemporary pop culture samurai representations? And what do you think that your book and the exhibition has in it that will appeal to big fans of these depictions, or maybe might shift their perspective?
We wanted a good representation of the post-war playing with the samurai image right from the beginning, and I guess I was apprehensive that that wouldn't be so easy to achieve at the British Museum, that we tend to focus on historical material more, and that's the way that we're perceived. But we're very much about capturing what's going on in contemporary society as well for the future. So I think it does work as part of our mission, but it's been incredibly complicated in terms of licensing. And I want to emphasize that there's some elements, the pieces of intellectual property that we wanted and we couldn't get. So we're not saying that this is a representative selection, but they're all really powerful pieces. And I hope people will enjoy seeing shows that they've loved or video games that they've loved playing when they come to the exhibition. Unfortunately, we don't have capacity to let people actually play games, but you get a sense of the drama and the excitement from seeing some cutscenes. And maybe they'll discover some new things. But I think primarily, I hope they'll be able to connect to the past and from where the samurai story in the post-war period, the rich panoply of uses of the samurai image, where it came from. They'll learn about the historical reality, and then they'll find all of that fun, familiar material from the post-war period.
Great. And of all of this really wide range of objects that you brought together for this exhibition and the book, among these objects and images, are there any particular ones that genuinely surprised you as experts?
I can think of a lot. And it's really been interesting seeing what the installation team are surprised by, because we're very familiar with these objects now. But one of the favorites has been a helmet in the shape of an aubergine. And I learned just yesterday that aubergines are berries. Didn't know this. This is every day's a school day. So there's a lot of ostentatious helmets historically from 1500s right through to 1700s. People carried on making these things as identity markers. Particular types of helmets were passed down in families, very often from generation to generation, these wacky shapes. So the aubergine helmet has been surprising and very popular. One of my favorite objects in the exhibition is the portrait of the young samurai diplomat who went to the Vatican, set out in 1585 on what was called the Keicho mission. He was called Ito Mancho. Arrived in the Vatican finally, and on their way out of Italy, when he was in Venice, his portrait was painted by Jacopo Tintoretto, and he has a beautiful starched white ruff, just like a proper Italian gentleman, and a velvet jacket. So it's this fascinating biography of this young man who was about 16 years old by the time the portrait was painted, by a well-known European painter. I could go on and on, but the hand scroll that records the life of the samurai during the early 1800s, when they were these officials for the domain, they were reporting for duty, having to spend a lot of their time in Edo, the shogun's power center that is today Tokyo. They're in their barracks in Edo and they're bored. So when we were talking to people about the exhibition, they loved this idea of bored samurai. Who knew? They just had a lot of hours to kill. They didn't have enough work to occupy all the hours, and they weren't allowed to leave the barracks. They had to get permission to do that. I mean, there were restrictions on how much they could leave. And then in the final section, maybe people will be surprised by Darth Vader. He went up yesterday, just being finished and fully dressed. But there's a very strong connection between that iconic look of the samurai armor that we were talking about earlier and Darth Vader's helmet. That's where the inspiration came from for that iconic flared look to the helmet. And then George Lucas has talked about how many elements he was drawing from the films of Kurosawa Akira in particular. So not just the costumes, but some of the words, some of the thinking behind the film, the plot even. But my absolute surprise for other people, I hope, is the samurai sitting on a rubber duck. So this is a special commission for the exhibition by a wonderful contemporary Japanese artist called Noguchi Tetsuya. And he plays with the samurai image endlessly. He's interested in the armor, primarily. That was where his work began. He was doing historical research on armor and creates these meticulous, miniaturized replicas or representations of these figures in handmade armor, made as if it was real armor, and he puts them in wacky situations, incongruous, anachronistic settings, emulates older painting techniques, sometimes Japanese, sometimes European. So we have a painting by him kind of in the style of Rembrandt, but this sculpture is a man in armor sitting on a bright yellow rubber duck. And it's to do with needing some whimsicality in our life, maybe some playfulness in troubled times, but it's also inspired by the very cute yellow rubber ducks of various historical characters that we sell in the British Museum shop.
Oleg, how about you?
Have I taken them all now?
Rosina did take quite a few of my favorites there, but I think there's some themes I pick up on. Certainly, Noguchi's work and the samurai with the rubber duck is phenomenal. That's one of my favorites, and that's one of the things I think more recently people have also felt, that they can be a bit more playful with samurai maybe than they would have been able to in the past. I mean, we have another one that I really like because I remember seeing, I think it was the 2006 World Cup. Essentially these two it's on gold leaf, an amazing kind of promotional poster of these two samurai kind of going into a tackle for a football. And which is just amazing.
With their jerseys on.
Yeah, wearing their jerseys. So they're wearing their football, their soccer jerseys, going into this tackle. And so some of these irreverent things, and I think that's something that's kind of through the entire exhibition, actually, even when we look at kind of some of the early modern woodblock prints and things like that, there's just some things are a bit irreverent. And this is also part of, kind of a Japanese sense of humor, I think, that kind of goes through periods. And I mean, we've got like a wonderful woodblock print of a procession, a samurai procession, and then kind of behind the wall, people shouldn't be out looking at this, you should be bowing down, but behind the wall of the building it shows where the children are there kind of messing about, and you've got animals here and there's a little cat here, and there's just all these wonderful little things. I mean, the aubergine helmet is I think in that category as well. There's just some really odd kind of helmets and details and things that we see kind of throughout things, and I think that portrait that Rosina mentioned by Tintoretto, the samurai delegate who's going to Europe, one of my favorite pieces, and that just really surprised me when I saw it, is almost a counterpart to that with an Italian connection. And a couple of years ago, Rosina and I went to Italy, went to a few different places to just visit various collections, looking for objects. And one of the places we went was the Oriental Museum in Venice, which kind of the origins of that museum were Prince Henry, the Count of Bardi, in the late 19th century was essentially collecting all of these objects from around Asia. He spent time in Japan, brought back thousands of objects, including a lot of armor, swords, and other things that are in there. But one of the things that's in there is a couple of amazing portraits of him, kind of red beard in samurai armor, and then also wearing kind of the equivalent of what Rosina referred to as kind of the samurai business suit. One of my favorite pieces, because it's I guess some very early cosplay there of this this Italian nobleman dressing up as a samurai in Japan.
Wow, thank you for sharing about all of those objects. I was expecting none of them, but they all feel so human somehow in their specificity and sometimes weirdness. And
apart from Darth Vader.
Apart from Darth Vader, that's fair. Yeah.
He's many things, but
not relatable in the same way.
No, he's special.
Just thinking about all of these different incredible objects all together, what do you hope that people who either encounter these objects in your book or in person at the exhibition, what do you think they can learn there that they aren't going to learn elsewhere about the samurai?
It goes back, I think, to that diversity of roles that they've played within society across the centuries. That there's been a lot of samurai exhibitions in the past that have looked at the fantastic armor, the beautiful swords, and we have a few swords in the exhibition, but we're trying to explain that wasn't one of the primary focuses. And they've had the artworks, they've explored the cultural side. We're trying to show a bit more of the brutality, as we were talking about, of the medieval warfare, the reality of that side of it, but then also the mundanity of life in the Edo period. That yes, there were beautiful objects still being created, but they weren't, and beautiful military objects still being created and beautiful cultural objects, but the actual reality of samurai lives was very different. And then the exploration of the representation, I think, is something that hasn't happened as thoroughly as it could have been explored, perhaps. But the real new section, I think, is going through that difficult period that Oleg talked about, looking at what happens when Japan has to modernize, westernize to a certain extent, and join an international community and play by the rules, or that it hasn't set itself. It's got to join this international order and find a way to survive somehow. So that exploration of how the samurai image plays out in that historical context, I don't think has ever been done before. So that should be very, I hope it will be interesting for people, enlightening, help them to understand better what was going on there.
I would echo that, and I think I'd maybe mention a bit more on kind of that, the influences that the samurai have on views of Japan in other countries, and just to kind of stress that, because I think oftentimes, the samurai are one of the first things that people think about when they think about Japan. And now that does tend to be more innocuous. It does tend to have to do with popular culture, video games, films, things like that. But that wasn't always the case. And I think if we're looking at, say, kind of the 1930s and 1940s, how Japan was viewed by other countries was really kind of through this lens of the samurai, that kind of the people of Japan, especially the Japanese military, were somehow directly related to kind of the samurai warriors of the past. And it was a way of, I think, it was a way of understanding what's a very different culture, very much orientalizing, and often to this extent, especially in kind of the United States and UK, kind of dehumanizing, I would say, even like the kind of the Japanese enemy at that time. And that was one of the things that I think was really interesting for us to look at and realize, because this is also an academic research project. We've had over kind of 20 different scholars from around the world contributing to this and working on this, and they have columns in the book about kind of specific aspects of their research. But one of the things I think that is, to me at least, becoming clear is how kind of the samurai are used by the Japanese government and military for indoctrination, for kind of ideological purposes, to support the imperial project in the early 20th century, and kind of to inculcate virtues of loyalty and self-sacrifice and things like that. We do see that, but I think it's actually much more important in other countries and how they view Japan. I don't think that in Japan people are necessarily thinking about the samurai as much as people who are thinking about Japan in the US or UK, where Japan is an enemy in the Second World War, but also Italy and Germany, where Japan is an ally. And they're really seeing that, Japan's samurai spirit, that's what's going to help ultimately Germany and Italy, supposedly succeed in the Second World War, that's one of the big elements there for Japanese strength. And so Japan is kind of being defined through that in the 1930s and especially in the early 1940s. And what that then does to the samurai image, that takes quite a long time to undo. It does take quite a long time for samurai to become an accepted thing, not just in Japan after 1945, but also in other countries. And things like the films of the samurai films of Akira Kurosawa, things like that kind of feed into that and kind of help do that. But it's a long process, and it really does have a big influence on how the world sees Japan even today.
Right, and so getting to re-examine these images and objects related to the samurai from all these different angles helps us crack open not just what we think we know about the samurai, but how we understand Japan on a global scale as well. I think that's really fascinating and important. And yeah, I want to thank you both again so much for joining me today and sharing your experience and expertise that has gone into creating this book, Samurai, and the accompanying exhibition. And as we like to do here on The Collector, I have one last question for you that we ask everybody. We can start with you, Oleg. If you could choose just one single cultural work of any kind that is the one you could enjoy for the rest of your life, what work would you choose and why?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll keep it on the samurai, but I will go slightly beyond the exhibition if that's allowed.
Of course.
This kind of goes back to Rosina and my journey to Italy and our trip around. And there's a museum on kind of the suburbs of Florence called the Stibbert Museum, which is an Anglo-Italian collector founded this in the late 19th century. And in that museum, there is an amazing samurai helmet with a huge golden octopus on it, like really realistic golden octopus, which I think is made of paper mache, which we really wanted for the exhibition, but unfortunately, it's too fragile to travel. It's a few hundred years old paper mache gold octopus. I can understand it's not very mobile, but if I could have one object out of all of this I have around, I think that would probably be it for me.
That's an incredible choice. Rosina, how about you?
I can stay within the scope of the exhibition. There's a beautiful armor surcoat in blue silk, and it's got very delicate, incredibly detailed embroidery of a scene of one of these very early warriors from the battles, the campaigns in the north of Japan in the 1080s, called Minamoto no Yoshiie. And he is a lover and a fighter. So he's returning from victory in the north, but he stops at the Nakoso barrier, which is seen as the divide between the civilized center around Kyoto and the barbaric wastes of the north. And he composes a poem on the poignancy of the falling cherry blossoms. And I think you could look at it, and it's a beautiful object, but you could also wear it. And I think the samurai man who would have worn it in the Edo period would have been very proud that he was combining these two qualities. There's the image of the legendary warrior, but in a delicate material with incredible craftsmanship.
Awesome. I think if the premise of my question ever turned out to be literal, and we were suddenly devoid of cultural objects, you would both be extraordinarily well dressed. Thanks again so much, Rosina and Oleg. It's been a pleasure, and
please come and see the exhibition.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you. For all of our listeners, Samurai is being published by the British Museum Press, and the exhibition runs at the British Museum in London from February 3rd to May 4th. In the meantime, subscribe to The Collector and stay tuned for more exclusive conversations on art, history, and culture. You can also visit thecollector.com for even more stories about the samurai, plus thousands of other topics. Until then, thank you for listening.